Does it really matter what the original writer meant? This is what I get from the passage, and if it makes sense to me, isn't that all that really matters? Who's to say that my understanding of the passage is wrong just because it might not have been in the mind of the original writer? Daniel's words frame this week's discussion board, and the central issue at stake is whether or not the intended meaning of the original inspired writer of the biblical text is authoritative, instructive, or even relevant for believers today. We all know people like Daniel who treat the Bible as though it were merely a collection of images, stories, and object lessons without a history, context, or original audience. In many ways, they treat the Bible like a Rorschach inkblot test. You know, the test psychologists and psychiatrists use to surface latent attitudes and idiosyncrasies in their patients. The test is created by pouring ink in the middle of a piece of paper and then folding it in half. When unfolded, all sorts of patterns and images emerge. The psychiatrist shows the inkblot to the patient and then asks, "Now what do you see?" The patient's answer says more about the patient than the inkblot. Everyone's seeing something different. Finally, it really doesn't matter what the patient is holding in his hand. There's no right answer to the question, "What do you see?" You see, he's not interpreting the inkblot anyway. He's only interpreting himself. Do you know anyone who treats their Bible like a Rorschach inkblot? Let me tell you what I see in this passage. When I was in seminary, about 100 years ago, I had a wonderful Old Testament professor who would later become a good friend, Dr. Clyde Francisco. He used to say, "We can never forget that the Bible was the Word of God to somebody else before it was the Word of God to us." That makes it incumbent upon me as an interpreter of the Bible to recognize the twin questions of biblical interpretation. First, what did it mean? And then, what does it mean? You cannot do justice to the second until you have adequately answered the first. To do otherwise is to reduce the Word of God to a Rorschach inkblot test. The only way to ensure that one has dealt faithfully with the Word of God is to recognize that it has a history and context and meaning quite apart from what I find there when I approach it with my modern, personal, introspective 21st century questions. To deal adequately with the context of the biblical text requires me to do the hard work of setting the biblical text in its history and culture and language and setting and experience. Only then am I in a position to move the text into my world and ask, now that I've understood this passage in its context, what is the Word of God for me here and now? There will be continuity between those two words, a continuity that, if ignored, will do violence to the Word of God. That's why, if you really love the Word of God, you will take the time to ask the hard questions and do the hard work of trying to live yourself into the time, culture, and experience of biblical people. Only then will you hear the voice of God speaking through the voice of the inspired biblical writer. And when you do, you'll say, you know, in what he said way back then and there to them, I think I heard a word from God there for me. That's the issue in this week's case study. Let the conversation begin.